Welcome to Chapter 11. This chapter is discussing total rewards and compensation, something, of course, we all get excited about. So let's dive right in. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to identify the three general components of total rewards and give examples of each, explain the major laws that govern employee compensation, and outline strategic compensation decisions. You should be able to understand the challenges of managing global compensation systems, illustrate the steps in developing a base pay system, describe how individual pay rates are set. So let's look at the nature of total rewards and compensation. When we look at monetary and non-monetary rewards that companies provide to attract, motivate, and retain all of us as employees, those are your total rewards. It's the full package. Strategic decisions can help guide the design of the compensation practices so that they're cost effective for the organization, that there is equity both internally and externally for employees, and that, of course, they're in compliance with all applicable laws and regulations, both domestic and foreign, and local and federal. There should be an optimal mix of various components, not just one path in which you take, but it should be a nice blend, and it should enhance the performance within your organization. Basically, when we're rewarded for doing a job well done, our performance usually increases, especially if the reward is great and significant. Performance recognition and talent management should be two major components that you're focused on, making sure that you are keeping track of the performance displayed and how you're recognizing them, the way you go about recognizing them, and then also the ways in which we go about recruiting and involving and retaining employees. These are all factored in. It's understanding the human dynamic and the motivation that we can spark through our reward system. Figure 11.1 shows you the components in a visual graph where it shows the typical distribution among those three types of compensation. Tangible is both indirect and direct, and intangible. And you see that our biggest portion of that pie, which is 60%, comes from the tangible, direct rewards, right? Where you can feel it. It's the check, it's the watch, it's the trip, to the Caribbean, it's the cruise to Alaska, it's the car. It's something that's tangible and direct. That's what it should make up, and that's what typically makes up the compensation in an organization. Here's some other ways of looking at the elements, and this was adapted from worldatwork.org. Other indirect rewards that are tangible would be our healthcare benefits, having paid time off, and disability benefits. Something intangible would be having autonomy, where you can make decisions without the added need of, without the bureaucratic kind of, well, I have to now wait for. I have the autonomy to make the decisions without prior approval, right? Having a supportive work environment, challenging work, positive reinforcement. Those are all intangible. There's also, you can't put a dollar amount on it. Is very helpful. And as you see when you go back up, it still makes up 10%, right? It's not like it's not a little slither, but it's still something. It makes people feel like, okay, you know, I'm in it. But those tangible rewards, those are the ones that really set the pace for us. Now, some other components to look at would be our base pay, which is your basic compensation, hourly wage or salary. Our wages are calculated from the basis of time that we work. Our salary are the consistent payments made each period, regardless of number of hours you work. Variable pay is always linked directly to you, your team, or the organization's performance. And then benefits are the indirect rewards that you can receive as part of membership in an organization. There are certain laws that govern compensation. FLSA is our Fair Labor Standards Act. This covers minimum wage, child labor provisions, exempt and non-exempt statuses, as well as overtime pay. Oops, sorry. Need to keep that on here. There we go. The primary federal law that affects compensation that's enforced by the Department of Labor, and specifically the wage and hour division in the department, it focuses on minimum wage, limiting the use of child labor. Years ago, we didn't have child labor laws. And so when you had men away at war, they brought in women and children, and then realized, wow, we can work the mess out of children. And so they continued doing so until laws were enacted to say, oh no, you cannot have a child working 12-hour days and 15-hour days and working 7 days a week. No. Even in the late 80s, the laws were less strict than they are now. And I remember working at a store called Drug Emporium, and I was 13, 14 years old. And interesting enough, like one of my managers, she was like my age, and we went to the same school. I'm like, this is really awkward. But I remember that I was working about 20 hours a week, if not more sometimes. Anyway, FLSA also will deal with the overtime, as I mentioned earlier, provisions. So there's certain legal constraints that are on pay systems that are aligned with this, as well as the minimum age of employment with unlimited hours is 16. You can, if you're 14 to 15, you may work outside school hours with certain limitations. And you have to be at least 18 to work in hazardous occupations. Now, the only way to change minimum wage is through congressional action. So when we were talking in 2015 and 2016 about setting a fair wage, the reason why it was being just repeated over and over and why some people didn't understand, well, what's the big deal? Just change it. Well, Congress has to move that peg to make it happen. And as long as Congress doesn't feel the need to, well, then guess what? Their pay will go up while yours will stay the same. So, and you do understand that you can have a federal minimum wage that, but your state minimum wage does not have to meet federal. See how that kind of goes, how it plays. But a lot of states usually mirror the federal level. Now, some of you may be saying, you heard me mention exempt and non-exempt employees. An exempt employee is anyone who's not paid overtime. If you are, or if you are paid overtime, or you must be paid overtime, you are non-exempt. Overtime is established based on the requirement of 1.5 times your regular pay rate for any hours worked over 40 in a week. Now, some companies try to be really creative, I'll say. It's really unethical in how they calculate your 40 hours in a week, because what they'll do is they'll adjust their work week to not reflect a Sunday to Saturday kind of rotation or Sunday to Sunday kind of thing. They will split the week so that somehow they can get you at 40. You work over, but somehow you're not technically getting 40. They'll try to make it seem as though one of those days that would have counted towards the 40 was actually part of the previous week. So you have to stay on top of looking at and understanding what the calendar week is, and being very clear, because some companies will be very creative in those calculations. Now, how do you determine exempt status? If you're an executive, administrative professional, where it's learned and creative. If computer, outside sales, including pharmaceutical sales, you are exempt. Looking at the different criteria, the pay level per week has to be a minimum of $455 a week, and you have to be paid on a salary basis, and your job duties and responsibilities need to include managing, having some kind of discretion or judgment with your decision making. You have to have some kind of advanced knowledge and or training education, and there has to be some kind of pursuit of artistic or creative endeavors. Any of these, right, are some major criteria for exempt status. Now remember, what did I say exempt status is? You are not paid overtime, right? So here are some special pay overtime issues that must be considered. Being paid for time off from work, incentives that you can provide non-exempt employees, training time, security inspection time, after hours email time. That's a biggie, because a lot of companies believe that they can email their employees after hours over the weekend and expect a response back. And those are sticky because they're after hours. That's someone's personal time. Something else, another issue that always comes up is travel time and what's called donning and doffing time. Now, let's look at the acts of legislation and how that affects compensation. We have the Paycheck Fairness Act and the Equal Pay Act of 1963. These are big ones, right? And the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act and our independent contractor regulations. Now, the last one is really interesting because a lot of companies, and I've mentioned this before in previous lectures, will try to give someone an independent contractor status, and they're actually employees. Remember, we discussed the difference between a contractor and an employee. So there's a lot of regulations that are tied to that. Now, there are criteria. If you control their behavior, how they make money, when they make money, and the type of relationship they have, these are some key things that is zoomed in on, because if you have a lot of control over this person, they're more likely an employee than they are an independent contractor. An independent contractor, when I come in to do work for a company as an independent contractor, oftentimes I'm using my own resources. It can be at my place or at theirs, but it usually, the time is, I've already set what my time is going to be, unless somehow I have restrictive time variables due to when the facility is open to personnel and things of that nature. And usually there's certain decisions that I have autonomy to make that are aligned with my role in that project or that task that the client does not have direct control over, if that makes sense. Now, when we look at compensation, we have what is called a prevailing wage. There's a formula that is calculated that considers the rate that is paid for the job by the majority of employers in a specific geographic area that's appropriate to and more aligned with the a certain core area, right? Garnishment. You guys all have known about, heard about, maybe even experienced garnishment. It's a court order that directs an employee to set aside a part of your wages to pay a debt that you owe to a creditor. That could be to the state, to the IRS. It could be to a number of entities that you owe money, and they just deduct that right out of your pay. Now, when we look at the decisions that we make strategically about compensation, we have to look at our organizational climate and make sure that we reduce dissatisfaction with compensation. There is a philosophy called entitlement philosophy that assumes that individuals who've worked another year with the company are entitled to pay increases with little regard for performance differences, meaning that you just pay them more. It doesn't matter if they're performing well or better or not. All right, it's a sense of entitlement. Then there's a pay for performance philosophy that assumes that compensation decisions reflect performance differences, and so that you're paying for performance. Looking at the two side by side, entitlement, the pay and raises are based on length of service. It's across the board raises, so everyone just gets it. The pay scales increase annually. There's comparisons industry-wide of just on pay alone. And of course, holiday bonuses are given to all employees. Just doesn't matter. It's just, you're entitled to it. But when you look at the difference, if on performance, you don't get a raise if you're a poor performer. The market helps to adjust the pay scales. So based on what the market looks like is how you're paid. And it doesn't matter how long you've been with the company. It doesn't matter your status within the company. That's not how your raise is determined. It's based on performance. And when they look at the entire industry to look at total rewards and how that is factored into the performance, so you can see how the two are side by side. I like if I have to choose between the two, I prefer performance over entitlement, or if there's a way to have a healthy balance between the two, because I like holiday bonuses, right? If the company does well as a whole, it's kind of cool if you can get a holiday bonus, or if you could get some kind of little bonus or some kind of something for being with the company for an extended period of time. But if you're a low performer, I just don't think that you should, if you're not bringing anything to the table, I just don't think you should get a bonus of sorts. You shouldn't get a pay raise because you've been with the company. Just because you've been with the company. If you are not excelling in your job, then why should you be compensated anymore? So if there's a healthy balance between the two, I prefer that. So we have to communicate the pay philosophy clear across for all employees to understand. It helps employees recognize the value of that total reward package, how their work performance, tenure, and raises can impact their compensation, and it can improve work attitudes. There are some responsibilities that are tied to compensation. If you're an HR specialist or a manager, you administer the programs. You help to develop the compensation system and ensure that pay practices comply with all legal requirements. And then line managers, right? The front line is responsible for evaluating performance and participating in pay decisions. Now, payroll administration is handled in different ways. You can process payroll through HR alone, or you can have payroll staff that reports to HR or to accounting, or you can outsource payroll. And you find that a lot of companies are outsourcing it or they're having HR do it. And then sometimes you have a designated separate staff. But and when I say outsource, understand it doesn't mean that it's going off to another country. It's just outsourced to another company that's probably all they do is payroll services. Now, record keeping is critical, and you're responsible for being accurate and making sure that you're complying with all compensation laws. And some people don't understand the importance of holding on to documentation for X number of years, because you never know if a lawsuit may come up. You never know if there's something that's tied to that employee and authorities need access to their records. So making sure that you're remaining compliant with whatever local, state, and federal guidelines are, but also whatever your senior leaders state that they want to maintain records for a certain period of time. It may cap at whatever the governing laws are, or they may decide to keep the documentation even longer. So let's look at the metrics tied to compensation. When we have an average hourly rate, how we go about calculating that is you take the hourly rates of pay for all of your employees individually and then divide by the number of employees that you have. Then with our FTEs, those are your number of full-time equivalents. You add the annual hours that are paid for all employees. You divide by the number of hours a full-time employee works. And so this is frequently 2,080 hours, right? If you're looking at how that calculates. Then when you look at average tenure, you add the total years of service for all employees, then divide by the number of FTEs. So of course you have to already have your FTEs right calculated. Now, to calculate the average comparative ratio, you're going to calculate the comparative ratio for each employee, then add those ratios, and then divide by the number of employees. And then productivity, and I believe we discussed this in a previous lecture, is, and I could be wrong, but you divide the total revenue by the number of FTEs. That's how you determine productivity. So you know where you stand, and then what's that number of full-time equivalents. And then you can see how productive your team really is. And then your average annual salary increase. You calculate the salary increase for each employee, add those increases together, and then divide by the number of FTEs. So you can see how knowing your annual hours that you pay for all employees and then the hours of full-time employees is scheduled to work. Having that FTE is important because you see that it factors in to about 3 other metrics. So being accurate is very key. Now, we talked about the expectancy theory where you're motivated based on the probability that your efforts are going to lead to some kind of performance that's linked to some kind of reward. So basically, rewards that aren't appreciated by you have little value to motivate. If you don't appreciate it, okay, so what? You gave me a pencil. Whoop-de-woo. I'm going to keep doing the level of work that I've been doing. Now, if you tell me that I'm going to get a car or $50,000, that's motivation, right? So it's finding out the trigger, finding out what motivates, and understanding also culturally certain things will motivate certain cultures and not others. If you go into countries such as China, a bicycle would be a greater reward than, a watch, right? Is you have to understand the motivation of your workers. Now, here's a visual. We have the expectancy and you have the perceived likelihood that the time that you're going to invest learning a new product feature that is going to lead to better sales. That then filters into instrumentality where that perceived likelihood can lead to better sales performance, and then of course a higher commission pay. And then valence is the value that you place on receiving the high commission pay. So you see how they're all tied together. My perception about the amount of time, the likelihood that my performance is going to lead to higher commission pay, and then the value that I place on that pay. Equity theory is how we go about judging fairness in compensation by comparing our inputs and outcomes against the inputs and outcomes of those that we revere, that we place on high stages, and the high performers. And they're the ones who have been high achievers, and they've been setting the standard consistently. So that's who we then use as our reference point to make all other comparisons to, if that makes sense. So I'm going to look and I'm going to say, okay, so here's Joe's inputs and the outcomes, but compared to Karen, who's our reference point, Joe falls short, right? So we can't pay Joe what we're paying Karen. So we'll pay Joe closer to what we pay Mark, because Mark is just a little bit higher than Joe, but still less than Karen. So that's how you kind of can look at that. So you're making sure that it's fair, but that it's not that just because you like Joe, Joe gets paid what Karen gets paid. No, it doesn't work that way. So we have our inputs and outcomes, and you're looking at the skills and ability and tolerance and enthusiasm and how much support they have of colleagues and from colleagues. And then the outputs of the recognition and praise and thanks and sense of achievement and responsibility. Those are how those all come into play. If that makes sense. So let's just say that when you look at if you take these side by side and you look at the input of Joe, right? His skills, his determination, how enthusiastic he is, the effort he puts in, how tolerant he is, and you compare those to another employee, how do they line up? That's where equity theory is trying to make things equal, in a sense. Fair and equity, both internally and externally. And then you see that we have two types of justice: procedural and distributive. And then pay secrecy versus openness. We've talked about this before. It's like one of those things that I think is like dragging your nails across a chalkboard, where they tell you not to let anyone know how much you receive in pay. And that's because if I tell you that you're getting paid $80,000 a year, and you're so excited about getting paid $80,000 a year, but you find out that another colleague of yours, whether they've been working there as much, longer, less, whatever, but let's say they're getting paid $88,000, you want to know why. So rather than allow that conversation to take place, what you have managers say is you can't share what you get paid with anyone. And so some employees think, well, maybe they don't want me to say because maybe I'm getting paid more than my coworkers. But then you have other employees that say, maybe they don't want me to say because I'm getting paid less than my coworkers. So at some point, employees are going to talk, right? We're going to talk. We're like kids. So the difference is being open. And when you have something that's more equitable, then everyone knows. If you have something that's based on performance, then people know, well, I now know why I'm getting $80,000 compared to so-and-so who's getting $88,000 because my performance was low here or there, and it makes sense, right? When this is figure 1110 shows you the quartile strategies based on position, first, second, third quartile. And you can see your position of the organization in the labor marketplace. So let's say you're lagging. You have a lag the market strategy. That's when your company is going to target a pay range that 75% of other organizations will pay above and 25% will pay below your targeted range. Now, match the market strategy. Your company is targeting pay ranges so that 50% of other organizations are paying above and 50% of other organizations are paying below your targeted range. And then lead the market strategy. That's when your target is within a range that only 25% of other firms are paying above what you're paying, yet 75% of others are paying below. So you're up there, right? You're not that far up where only one or no, you pay more than everybody else, but you're positioning yourself in the labor marketplace in a way that keeps you in a comfortable setting within a range that allows you to be more strategic in how you roll out your pay. It gives you the wiggle room that if by chance there's bonuses or you have an increase in onboarding employees or whatever, you can factor all of this in. Now, the match the market strategy helps to balance your pressures for cost, right? Remember I told you we're talking about, let's say you have an increase in onboarding new employees, you're hiring new employees. You're always having to attract and retain your employees. You're getting, you're building, especially if you're growing, and let's say you're trying to go overseas or you just want to have locations in different cities throughout the U.S., you're having to attract new people in, and then you're trying to hold on to who you have already as well as the new people you get. And so you have to be able to have enough bandwidth and space to have enough compensation options that meet the market for your jobs that you're providing. So that's where you're matching where the market is. When you lead that market, it's a very aggressive, very aggressive, because the salary is very attractive, because understand we're all now having these access to these sites that we can see what the industry standard is compared to what the job is offering. If the industry standard is 100,000 and the job is only offering 60, most of us are like, no, thank you. Unless 60 is something that we've never achieved and we have always been accustomed to 20. Well, 60, we're so glad to have it. We reach for it. But if you're used to 60, you're used to 70, you're used to 80, you're trying to get as close to that 100,000 as possible. And to find an organization that's going to lead that market means that not only are you getting greater rewards financially, but the company's able to attract and retain sufficient number of workers that have the capabilities. It allows the organization to be more selective when hiring, right? Because you're going to weed through the riffraff. You're going to weed through the weaker links because you need the best of the bunch. Now, the lag with the market strategy is when you're having problems, your company is struggling, and you have there's a whole marketplace of workers that are available that you can just kind of pick from, but you don't have the money to go with a more aggressive strategy, and so you're kind of lagging behind. So let me show you again how that looks. See that? So 75% of other companies pay more than you, and about 25% pay less than you. See? So those are the three strategies explained to be more competitive in the marketplace. Now, how do you go about selecting the quartile? Which one do you choose to position yourself to target for pay structures? There's certain things you have to consider. How much money do you have available to you? Right? If you don't have the money, guess what you're not doing? You're not going to try to lead the market. You're just not. You're going to have to lag or, you're just not going to be able to do that. And then how much pressure do you have on you to be competitive? Are you running neck and neck with another organization? Is your product line about to roll out with something at the same time someone else is? What is going on internally that may help you determine which quartile to select? Something else is how many employees with different capabilities are available in the marketplace when you need it. If it's slim, if it's a lot, okay. If there's a lot of employees available but your resources are slim, what are you going to do? You're going to lag the market. So a lot of that comes into play. Now, you have to be able to make certain decisions about the mix. Remember, we talked about compensation mix and making sure that it's like a salad, colorful, different, has, different textures. It's the same thing with our packages, our compensation packages, rewards, making sure there's variety and that your competitive position is also clearly aligned, and that you're addressing this as part of your comprehensive total reward strategy. So remember, we talked about the total rewards. It has to all factor in. Now, competency-based pay rewards you for the capabilities you demonstrate and also what you acquire while on the job. And in knowledge-based pay, KBP, or skill-based pay, SBP, systems employees can start at a base level of pay. They can receive increases as they learn to do other jobs, right? So as they acquire more skills and become more proficient in other areas, you can actually increase that pay. And also gain additional skills and knowledge where you can be more valuable to the employer. So this is how the knowledge or skills-based systems can be implemented. And there are some issues when you look at rewarding individuals versus teams. How do you go about developing compensation programs that support the team concept? Oof, that could be so sticky, especially because, as we know, everyone may not be performing up to the same level, intensity, frequency, so on and so forth. Then you look at the individual, and how do you go about compensating individuals whose performance may be a result of team efforts and achievements, not necessarily based on their individual efforts and achievements. So those have to always be ironed out. Now, and you can see why, if you really take HR seriously, you don't just think that HR is just simply about onboarding paperwork and payroll, right? It's much broader and intensive and intentional and strategic and vital to the operations of an organization. Now, globally, we have tons of issues, right? I've talked about working and operating overseas. Oh my goodness. So you have more and more employees that are having to work internationally. You have to factor in those laws for that country. And please, if it's a country that ends up having its own internal kind of regional state kind of laws, provinces on top of what the national laws are, you have to factor in living cost and different policies related to taxes, how their currency fluctuates compared to how our currency fluctuates, the conversion rates of all those things, local wage scales, and tons of other things have to be considered. It's exhausting, right? It can be very exhausting. Hence why you a lot of times will have a separate HR division in that country, in those countries, to deal with compensation. And then all they do is report up to your headquartered location here in the US. Offshoring. That's where you're going to move a job to a lower wage country, right? Which is also, called outsourcing for most people. That's what most people see as outsourcing. But offshore is leaving your country and going to another. You're moving into a lower wage country. Reshoring is where you then return operations back to the U.S. You come on back home. Now, how do we go about assigning people internationally? You can have a home country-based approach or a host country approach. Home country maintains the standard of living for you, just like you had in your home country. Host country is going to compensate you based on the level as the other workers from that same country. So that could be a vast difference depending on where you've been reassigned. And figure 1111 is showing you the administrative process as it relates to compensation. You see the philosophy that goes into it, and that then funnels into the analysis of the job, how it's evaluated, the internal and external focuses, and then those force down to, when you have an external focus, it's looking at market pricing. The internal focus is going to look at point factor, ranking, and classification. Below those, you see the pay structure and individual pay decisions and how those are then, what factors into those. Are methods that we go about evaluating jobs. Just mentioned point, factor, ranking, classification, and factor comparison method. Job evaluation is the formal systematic means to determine um, the relative worth of jobs within an organization. Compensable factor is the job dimension that we commonly present throughout a group of jobs within an organization that can be rated for each job. So you get this out of job analysis. If you go back up, and you see how we back this in. Comes right through. So it reflects the nature of different types of work performed in the organization. And then market pricing is going to use your pay data from the market. It looks at the entire market. It's going to use that pay data to identify the relative value of jobs based on what other employers pay for similar jobs. So based on what everyone else in the marketplace is doing, we'll then place a value on how much we will pay for those identical or similar jobs in our company. And from there, we identify where the good matches are based on the jobs, any geographic considerations, any strategies and philosophies that we have about our competitiveness based on different levels within the market and where we desire to be. Are we trying to, be in the top 10 or the top 3? And so we factor all of these in when we set our pricing for jobs. There are some advantages and disadvantages, of course. When you tie organizational pay levels to the external job market without internal job evaluation distortion, there's an advantage there. However, the pay survey data may be limited or unsound. The compensation mix may differ from matching jobs in the market. And tying pay levels to market data can also lead to wide fluctuations. But on the flip side, an advantage is that it communicates to employees that the compensation system is linked to the market. It's not something that's randomly, mystically, magically appearing. Employees can then go to the market and see what other companies are paying comparable rates. Now, pay survey is the collection of all data that's on compensation rates for workers that perform similar jobs in other organizations beyond yours. So you're able to see the full scale across the board in your country, sometimes abroad. And benchmark jobs are found in a lot of organizations that can be used for the purposes of comparison. Now, you can go on to numerous sources and find pay information using the internet. And it makes some companies nervous, but other companies embrace it because then when they say this is part of the market, it's online, so you can see for yourself that you're getting paid $80,000. Well, guess what? The market has a window of pay of 95 to 70,000 for that same job. So you're right there in the middle. Now, when you use pay surveys, of course, just like any survey, it has to be relevant and valid. And it has to outline the participants involved in the survey. It has to be broad-based, right? It cannot be like narrowly based. It needs to be broad-based. It has to outline the methodology used. Was it quantitative? Was it qualitative? What details were involved in the survey? how they went about collecting it, any matches to jobs, and then of course the timeliness of when it's done um, compared to when it's this survey is released. So if it's done in um, 2010 and you're rolling it out, the results to try to do a comparison to apply it to current jobs in 2020, that is so off scale. So it needs to be timely. And you're permitted to participate in surveys only if they meet the following conditions. They have to be administered by a third party. The data cannot be more than 3 months old, right? It's too far out because things fluctuate, conditions change. There has to be a minimum of 5 employers that are participating in the survey. No single employer's data may be worth more than 25% of the total data used in the survey, right? Because if it's more than 25%, then it's weighing too much on one particular company. And all of the data must be aggregated and stripped of any identifying information, meaning that you're removing anything that can let a person know what company it is. It has to just be raw data, just the facts, Jack, right? But nothing that lets you know that this is Walmart or this is Citgo or this is Porsche or you can't know. Because at that point, it skews and places a bias in addition to the fact that it doesn't allow it to be raw and clear, right? It can make it seem as though possibly these were hand selected or possibly they have some kind of influence on the survey itself. Now, pay grades. We have individual jobs that are grouped together that have approximately the same value to the organization. And it's based on what the organization, how they place that value. And there is a graph line that shows the relationship between the value as determined by job evaluation points and then as it's determined by the pay survey rates, and that's called the market line. So you can then see the relationship between these two. Then we can band by grouping together. We can group jobs into pay grades based on similar market survey amounts. That is the market banding. So you have two different ways in which to group jobs based on the value within an organization for pay grade, and group jobs into pay grades based on the similar market survey amounts, right? And here it shows you that market line. And some of you may have seen this and you had no clue what you were looking at. But the pay survey results by job evaluation points equals the pay grade. So you have your hourly pay rate from $6 an hour up to $16 an hour. And you have your job evaluation points from 0 to 400. And the pay survey results are then by job evaluation points. So those are the ones that have the little diamond, blue diamonds. Those are right there. And then the regression equation is how they then calculate that in. So they'll calculate in for X and R squared so that they can end up getting Y in the equation to find out what the regression is. Now, each pay grade, pay level can be determined by making the market line the midpoint line of the new pay structure. So what you can do is have this line where it then can adjust for whatever midway point for whatever the new pay structure is going to be. So this line can adjust to help you then determine that new pay structure. Broadbanding has nothing to do with the internet, and as it pertains to compensation, it's a practice that you use fewer pay grades with much broader ranges than in traditional compensation systems. You have some organizations that are doing this because they don't want to have 10, 20, 30 plus pay grades. So they narrow down their pay grades and then they expand the range to be able to then have something that's more succinct. And of course, it breaks from tradition. So some people like it, some people love it, some people can't stand it. Because if you then have fewer pay grades, they're like, well, does that mean I hit a cap? But no, what it is, they're not paying attention that you have a broader range within those pay grades. So there are, of course, some pluses and minuses to everything, depending on how you look at it. And some people don't embrace change. So some people are like, wait a minute, what? Back that up, especially if you've been working in the workforce for 20 plus years, you're used to a more traditional model. Now, looking at individual pay, we have some red circled employees and green circled employees. And the red circled employees, anyone who's paid above the range that is set for the job. They're already above where, everyone else is being paid. However, you can also be paid below the range that's set for the job. So you're a green circled employee. You would think that it would be the other way around, right? Because red always seems to be a red flag, but I guess in a way, if you're being paid above the range, you are a red flag. Because you're now you're in another ballpark. You're in another category, another level. And imagine if you're being paid above the range set for the job, but you're not yet qualified to get a promotion to a higher rank. So you just are kind of in this, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a gully. You're just kind of there in the abyss. Not necessarily, but it allows you to then see where this person is. Now, to compress pay, this takes place when there's some differences in pay amongst your team members that have different levels of experience and performance becomes small. And you then compress those pay differences because there is not significant, I should say. So how do we increase our performance tied to compensation? Zoom in on your high performers, right? Focus on the ones who are doing the best, and by motivating them and compensating them and giving them those higher pay raises, their performance will continue to soar. You can also do what's called a pay adjustment matrix, which reflects your upward movement in an organization, and what's considered is your performance as rated in an appraisal, and then your position in the pay range. So those two things are considered in the matrix. And here is a visual of that. So you look at your current pay level. You see that midpoint right there? So you have your first quartile, second quartile, and then of course third and fourth. And so that midpoint is between the second and third. And do you meet expectations? And you see where the percentage is for each quartile. Do you exceed expectation, or are you below? Now, see, 0, of course, there's no pay adjustment if you're below expectation. There's no way you should get any kind of adjustment in pay. Nothing should be going up. But if you see that you're meeting, and some people will say, well, why does it get low right down here? Why does this number? It's because you're reaching the end of the year. This is year end. So it splits up, right? And then here's of course, the rating. So here's your pay. You see how that looks? So that's how you can do a matrix that way. Now, there's the standardized pay adjustments. And these are the ones that most of us are aware of. This is what we've been conditioned to. Based on seniority, you've been with the company for 25 years. Boom, you get that increase in pay. Cost of living adjustments. You've now relocated to California from Georgia. Yeah, cost of living is much higher, so they adjust your pay accordingly. Across the board increases, where it just factors in all the variables and also all of the employees, just across the board. Everyone's going to get an increase, and then lump sum increases, rather than it being a case of gradual increase or over a period of time. It's in lump sums. Now, economic recessions are a huge challenge for organizations, and I've discussed this before in previous chapters. When you're dealing with a recession in the economy, with the country, you're going to have to reduce as many employment-related expenses as you can. And you have to do so in a way that you can keep turnover as low as possible, and you can reduce the number of dissatisfied workers you have. Because when we face economic hard times, employees become fearful. And if they don't feel the support and genuine concern and consideration for the well-being of employees, your employees will become dissatisfied and they will start jumping ship out of fear. That is a huge challenge that you have to deal with. Something else is considering the gender pay gap. They say we've gained ground recently. We're getting a little inch by inch, but it's still huge. It's still a gap where basically white women get about 75 cents for every dollar that a white male gets. Of course, that number drops considerably when you start dealing with women of color. Black and Latino women, that could be 34 cents, 48 cents to a dollar. And then, of course, there's a gap that's increasing in executive level positions. So, okay, you're coming in, frontline, mid-level, whatever. But when you start talking about getting to those tippity top levels, that gap in pay is very significant. So it's something that our country still is not grappled. We have not adjusted to the current times. We have not realized the value of the female worker. And we have a lot of catching up to do. So with that is the end of Chapter 11. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Thank you.